Mystery of the giant trees. Now, if you've been going along with this research, if you've been following the great awakening of consciousness and ideas, uncovering the truth of our past, our story, where our place in this realm is, what we're a part of. One of the main giant clues or pieces of this puzzle are these giant trees. And when you start to investigate it and you start to accept this as being a major possibility, your consciousness expands and you start to see things in a different way. And it goes along with all the other theories of the giant people, the super civilizations, and all these kind of things that go along with this research. And the giant trees are a big part of that. So when you look at these old maps, this is a map of North America and South America, and you see it at the top, giant trees. Okay, so you can see North America and South America and giant trees growing. Now, when you think of this as the size of these trees in comparison to the land, these trees would have been very, very, very big. And the science people, the historians will tell you that, somebody drew the trees and then didn't get the scaling right or something. It's always a very lazy answer. And if we investigate this as knowing their stories are false or fabrications and lies, we can then go, what evidence do we have to support that there were super giant, titan sized, miles and miles tall trees? What can we do to support our claims that these trees did exist? Okay, now we investigate, we start to pool our resources together, and we see physical evidence. Now, if you look at this picture, you see a forest, and you might not see this at first, but this is a giant tree stump that's been clean cut by some type of technology. I mean, they didn't just hack this down with another stick. This is clean cut, and we don't know where the remnants of the trees were. Were they used by a larger civilization, like in the movie Avatar? If you remember that, they cut the big tree down and stuff. It's very symbolic of the cover up that this tree stumps and things like that that are this size cannot be hidden. And therefore, they just hide it in plain sight. They never acknowledge it. And as we've seen, hundreds of years go by without anyone ever catching on. Where when we join together, combining our research, we find all these clues or pieces of evidence that really cannot be disputed. Now, they will just pass these off as some kind of geological formation, but when you understand the clean cut aspect of these giant mountain ranges, it makes the people who are aware of these other ideas question things more and more and more. So, if you can get people to at least watch this information and accept this as a possibility, that's when you see the expanding of consciousness. And the general public, the NPC type people, never want to look at any of this. They don't want to look at or accept any version of reality that goes against their programming. They never ask questions. Somebody who has a degree in geology will just tell them something and they'll take it at face value. They never will ever question anything. We now know that the more you question these people who are responsible for our narratives, the less answers they actually have, and we can figure out that they're lying very, very quickly. So we look at these mountains as if they're giant trees, and we try to find more evidence to prove our theories or claims that these are giant trees. What else can we find when we investigate these sites? Now, often when you do go try to investigate these sites, all of a sudden government personnel will come out of nowhere and they'll tell you that you're not allowed to do any digging or excavating or anything like that because you could be disturbing, an Indian burial ground is one of the big things they like to go with. Now, the same people who are responsible for exterminating 50 million to 250 million Native Americans, now they're so concerned about don't harm any of their burial grounds and stuff. It's just like these people don't give a shit about any of your burial grounds. They don't want you to dig into these trees and find that there may be caved into the root systems and how far do they go and things like that. they You're not allowed to fly drones in a lot of these areas. You're not allowed to fly over there. It's got a protected airspace above it. And it's just so many factors where they don't want you to look into this and they don't want you to combine this research where you can make a compelling argument that also proves that they are lying. And these trees would have been miles and miles tall. So tall they would have reached the top of the firmament. They would have been out into the outer space or something. And it kind of disproves the spinning ball theory when you really start to look into this. That's one of the main reasons why they don't want any of this information out there. Because if you think, why would they care if there used to be giant trees 100 million bajillion years ago? Well, it kind of puts the idea that the timeline was so inflated and pushed back in order to push off the theories of evolution and things like that, that you can kind of prove that they're lying very quickly. And when you do have the claims that they're lying, you'll find yourself ejected from their arguments or anywhere where you can possibly sway the ideas or the thinkings of the general public, the NPC type people, and that is a big factor when we look at this. So here you can see there are also giant mushrooms, spores, molds, fungus, all that of gigantic proportion, along with the people that we've already covered of gigantic proportion. And the further back you go in our actual story, the bigger things all get, whether it's the mushrooms or the trees or the people or just the creatures in general, whether it be, insects, animals, things like that. And you could, the more you start saying, oh, I'm going to look into this, you'll find all sorts of new things, and everybody is intricate or integral in putting these pieces together, collecting all this research, finding all these pictures and all this physical evidence, and showing it to the people where eventually it's going to come a point where the narrative has to change to all of this new information that we found. The accepting of Tartaria, the accepting of flat Earth, the finding out, can we escape this realm? Can we go to other hidden lands and things like that? It's a very great time to be doing this research if we can get this research completed before they, try to pass off another one of their great resets. So these it's just the scale, the size of these trees, how big this would have been, and who would have cut these trees down, how they would have cut this down, where did all the wood go? We know there was this mud flood event, and does the sawdust, as they're cutting these trees, would that account for the massive amounts of mud and debris and things like that? And then we'll get into in a minute how the water factors in, which created this mud. So, you know, are these just random geological formations, or does this prove the claims that there were giant trees? And now here, look at this one. Totally cut on a 45-degree angle, the same way you would if you were logging or something like that. And it just Were they cut down with laser weapons? Were they cut with giant saws? Were there giant people in proportion to the trees that cut them down? We really don't know, but we do know there is lots of evidence to support the type of rings, the growth, the sap, the mold on the trees, all these kind of factors in to our theories of these giant trees, the people, the resets, and all the other information that we have gathered. And the root systems, the insects would have most likely been proportioned to the trees. So now you're thinking of wasps and bees and flies and mosquitoes flying around that would have been the size of, giant buses and stuff. And who knows what evidence they actually have to support these claims when every time we find something that goes against the narrative, the Smithsonian comes in and collects it and hides it and stores it where it's never ever seen again. And you see the fibrous strands that weave together and grow together. You see the rings, evidence of the rings and the different layers within the rocks. It really, it's right there for people to rediscover and find the truth. All the different kinds of molds and funguses would have been so much larger, especially with the trees providing more oxygen and nitrogen and things like that. That would have allowed for creatures and animals and people to grow a lot taller as well. You can always kind of, they want you to think this is just geology, but when you factor in the tree part of it, it kind of makes a lot more sense than this was just a geological randomness that caused all this. So here you can see this picture of all in the background, you see like a giant tree stump, and this could have been a limb. You got to think once the trees fell, the limbs would have been sticking up, and they could have cut them off. You think of the giant redwood trees in California. Is that a tree that fell over and these giant redwood trees would have been the half side of the limbs that would have possibly still been growing? We don't know, but every single theory and idea has to be explored for us to figure out what is going on. Now, here's more pictures of inside of these deep underground military bases or abandoned salt mines, as they claim. And it's clearly fossilized wood remains. All of these grains and things where you can see where limbs would have been and knots in the tree and growths, that's most likely they're in the bottom of these trees, hollowing them out, building structures, and preparing for the next massive flood event, which most likely could come because if, you know, the true people chosen by God are not in control, and the followers of the satanic takeover are in control, it's only a matter of time before another flood comes in and wipes humanity off the map again. So I think it's really interesting how this ties in with the movie Avatar, how they want you to understand these theories, whether it's the animated movie like Fern Gully, where giant super corporations are, you know, clear cutting these trees, these magical trees, and things like that. It's a very big part of they have to show you kind of what they're doing. They have to tell you the truth. And as long as they make it in a cartoon or a movie, no one would ever question or think twice when the people who are awake and aware see this as they have to tell you the truth, and that's how we know to look more into it, look deeper, do more investigations, collect more research, and then at a point we've got so much research collected, it really can't be disputed that these are giant trees. There were giant people, there were giant trees, and we see massive cover ups taking place every single time in order to keep you from figuring any of this out. And, if you know about, giant ground sloths or ground squirrels or something, they could have nested in the underground root system of these trees, and that could explain giant cave systems. So very, very interesting stuff that we are uncovering and looking into. And it's just the amount of you when you don't see it as a mountain, you see it as a tree. And there's other factors into this where there are also giant titan-sized people, which would have been miles and miles tall, that they died and are covered in the mud and they fossilized along with the trees. And you could get into that research more about mud fossils and things like that. So really interesting. Type in giant trees, research old world giant trees and things like that, and just you'll be flooded with the amount of information that has been accumulated. All right, next I want to show a quick video of more evidence that has been found.
Quick, I'm going to show you this, how the trees are fibers, and for some reason this shows the true color. A big chunk of this just fell off. See part of the grain. This is the way the fibers are right here. See? Hold on a second. And you see it's nothing but wood. Okay, so we're going to go down over here and I'll show you a little more. Okay, see here, and at an angle. Okay, all this, everything, this whole mountain in a 100-mile radius. Come right over here. You see, this looks just like freshly chopped wood. We peeled a piece off of there. This is what we see. This is the wood. See that? That's just got the moss on it. And all this here, all the way back up in here, I'll show you that in a second. You come right here and you see, we'll pull a piece off here. It's just wood. It's so crazy. All this. And then you go right over here. See? This is the fresh stuff. This is what we see. Actually grew. Go over here. It's part of the source tree.
So really interesting. I don't know if anyone's ever lived in the country or anything where you have to chop wood in the winter, but that's exactly what you kind of see when you start splitting giant pieces of wood. You see the fibers, you see the strands, you see the chunks, and that looks like where the trees fell, it starts to rot a little bit, and then you see how the fibers start to decompose and come apart. I don't know how anyone can disprove any of this when it is so right there for us to find and relocate this truth that's right on the cusp. We're right on the cusp of this great awakening taking place where people are understanding this, and it's the biblical aspects of this really come into play where we all figure out that we are being led down this road by this satanic influence, and that's what's causing everything to happen. So, who cut down these trees? When did this happen? And was the mud flood a byproduct of the cutting down of and removal of these giant trees? Now, one thing you could also look into is when doing logging and stuff, a big occurrence is they start cutting these trees down and water starts spraying out of these trees. So if they're hooked into an underground aquifer or something, but water just gushes out. So did they cut down these giant super Goliath mega trees and then water starts spraying out, which caused this mud flood? That is a very big possibility. Now, especially if you have the sawdust aspect to their cutting down all these trees, then all of a sudden a spring erupts from it, causing the water to sit on top of the sawdust and basically flooding out our entire realm with the sawdust and the wood cuttings and all these things of these trees and stuff. And it's possible that how would you turn the water off? I guess you could plug these holes or something, but if you just cut them down and then moved on, and then all of a sudden they start erupting with water out of them, I mean, you look in the background here, and the whole area is just flooded with the water from some underground well that is just pulling this water up through like a vacuum or a siphoning and flooding the entire realm with the water, with the mud, with the sawdust and things like that. It's a huge thing that I found or that people have found that really could make you go, well, that's most likely what caused this mud flood event. Very, very interesting. And there's lots of videos of this occurrence of the water shooting out of these cut tree limbs and stuff. If you do any kind of pruning anywhere, you'll find a lot of residual water coming out of wherever you cut the limbs off as a way the tree kind of repairs itself and seals itself. So that is a major part of when this mud flood event took place, when it took place, how it took place, what caused all this water. This isn't just regional flooding as if it was from a heavy rain. This is the sediment level and the mud flood aspect to this is everywhere at the same depth. So this had to be a universal occurrence that would have took place, burying all these towns and cities in this mud. And it's something that I look at very closely when looking into this and researching all of this. So, when talking about a realm wide flooding event along with mud, we have to ask why and how. This is not just flooding in one regional area, this was realm wide, catastrophic event. And how did this happen? When did this happen? And why? Did they cut these trees down in order to suffocate these giant creatures? And there's another idea that when you cut the trees down, the oxygen levels would fall. This would also maybe account for more heat is getting onto the ground, causing more evaporation. The more evaporation, the water sticks to the firmament, and then there is great rains, 40 days of rain, and stuff like that. Another very interesting thing when we look into this type of research or when we do our own research and we start asking these questions, if you could prove it on a small scale, it must be possible on a larger scale. And, was our realm much bigger before these trees were cut down? Now, think of it like air filling up a balloon. The more oxygen you have, the bigger the balloon gets. Now, you could think of our firmament kind of in the same way as a giant type of a balloon. Now, when the trees are cut down and the oxygen levels are reduced, the balloon shrinks and the firmament maybe shrinks. I think that is a big possibility when we look into this. Something to think about. So now we should talk about, or next we should talk about the mud flood, how it connects to the hijacking of the lost civilization. Now, if the world was covered with water and the mud was like a liquid sludge, you would need to wait until the mud hardened and settled. And this is where the term settlers come from. They would move into a city after the ground settled and stopped moving or the mud hardened, and how long it would have taken from the event occurring and the settlers moving back in. We don't know, but estimate it would have taken possibly 10 to 20 years, maybe 30 to 5 to 50 years. We arrive at this number by looking at the tree growth and the shrubs and things like that. Trees would not have time to take root until the water drained and the mud settled. Okay. And if you look around, you're not going to find a lot of trees in America older than 150 years. And that kind of puts into the idea of when these trees were cut down and how long was the new civilization put in place. If the tree growth supports a certain age and they're telling you, well, that doesn't mean anything because Christopher Columbus and all this stuff that they have invented. So these controllers have added so much time to our historical record or the accounting of our story. First, they add 1,000 years to the timeline or to our story, changing the dates from 850 to 1850. Now, that is almost 100% proven when the further back you go, the years were I 850 or J 850. And this would have been, J for Jesus or Jehovah, the year of God, the year of Jesus, 850. And that kind of explains all that. And then the I would also be a different way of spelling Jehovah God. If I don't know if you remember in the movie Indiana Jones, he's walking in that room, and if he steps in the wrong spot, the floor breaks through because Jehovah starts with an I in this certain letter. So it's very a part of all of this research. When you put this together, when you have the brain power to really pull yourself back and view this story in several parts, figure out what the parts, assemble the pieces, and then reassemble them to figure out what the truth is. Now, when they move these timelines back, they then come up with these theories to base their narratives on. And this is where we begin to see the theory of evolution and the Big Bang theory. And this could add infinite amount of time to place historical artifacts and old world sites. So all of these civilizations weren't a part of one world, the way we see it today, where it doesn't matter if you're in France or Russia or England or America or wherever, you can get a Pepsi anywhere. You can get the same type of things everywhere, which would account for it's one giant civilization, not multiple civilizations that weren't aware of each other. This was a united world, united through trade, united through um, events taking place, whether it was this mud flood, whether it was this biblical events of Moses and things like that, it all connects when you understand that. Now, out of place artifacts would be hidden, seized, confiscated, or destroyed. We see many reinventions and mechanical devices that are far advanced from the 1800s time period. And you know, speaking to the idea that we're all one civilization, all first world nations and stuff have cars or trucks or some version of a car or a truck. It's only when you go to like Africa, they haven't even invented the wheel yet. They have no written language, there's no accounting of anything, and no one really knows what's going on. When you get into more developed areas, you see the technology kind of universal, where an axe in Russia is the same as an axe in America. Now, it might be different designs, but a shovel is a shovel, a wheel is a wheel. All these things kind of go together the same way civilization would have been united back then. So then we understand the ideas of this mud flood and how there was an advanced civilization. We see all this um, equipment, and they would say, well, there's no evidence of any of this advanced civilization. Now, when you are researching and you say, okay, there's no hints at an advanced civilization, and you say, look at the trees are all cut off, when they'll say that's just a random geology and things like that. This is where the mud fossil aspect of this research really starts to take off. Now, In this next picture, this is a tank from World War II. A German, I don't know what kind of tank this is, a Tiger tank or a Panzer. I don't know what this tank is. It doesn't matter. But this tank ended up being submerged in a muddy bog. And then they drained it off trying to get this out. And they can see that the tank has already reverted back to its base minerals and elements and things like that. This is this mud fossilization process, which takes base elements, minerals, things like that, and converts them into other base elements and things like that. It's kind of hard to explain. The mud fossil part of this research is a giant part of all this research, but it's like a whole separate documentary has to be made on the mud fossils and the mud fossilization aspect of how all things within nature are giving and taking. They're passing electrons, they're exchanging minerals and elements. They are always converting energy, whether it's from turning water into steam, from steam into liquid, and from liquid into ice. There's always changing that's taking place. Now, the same thing happens whether you're submerged in mud. And this nucleophilic substitution takes place where the minerals are exchanging. And if the minerals of the mud have more electrons, you'll see whatever the original object is. Like in this case, this tank exchanges the minerals with the mud, and the mud like pulls whatever kind of alloys or whatever's been added to the base metal to create steel. It reverts it back, and the mud steals it, turning it back into the land kind of before it was manufactured into something. If that makes sense. It's kind of hard to explain because it takes so much, but there's a lot of evidence that can kind of prove this. And now this is where you would get into the mud fossils and how you can prove the existence of the giant trees and the giant people. Now, to fully explore the mud fossils will take a separate video. I do not have I do have a video on mud fossils. It needs to be redone. It was one of the first videos I did when I started making videos, and it has to be re-recorded, remastered. But it's just like anything else. You see these theories of mud fossils, and you say, okay, if this theory is true, if I go start digging in my backyard, I should find these things. Where you do start digging, you do find these things. They're everywhere. It's a realm wide thing that all goes hand in glove. And they do not want you digging and looking for anything in the ground because of what could be possibly buried everywhere within our realm, and that's a big part of this.